Hello, I hope you had a lovely month in May and had a chance to read some good things. I want to have a casual chat about everything that I read over the past month. I read 9 books in total, and I'm currently reading a 10th, which is such a pleasure to read. But I had a very mixed experience with a lot of these books. Some of them I was really anticipating, and they turned out to be quite disappointing, and others were just really great reading experiences. So I'm going to talk about all of that, but also just wanted to mention some fun bookish things that I did in May as well. So at the very beginning of the month, I got to go to Paris for a weekend to meet my parents there, and it was really lovely to hang around with them and see them, but also to have a journey through Montparnasse Cemetery and see some graves of some authors that I really respect and love. And so I made a whole vlog about that experience, which I'll link below. I also got to go to the International Booker Prize ceremony, which was really exciting, and it was lovely to meet there the Bookstagrammers Bernie and Sarah. I met Sarah a number of times before, and she's so good at these parties. She's really sociable and goes and outgoing and goes and chats with everyone, where Bernie and I kind of hung at the sides, and we were like, oh wow, that's really cool. There's Bernardine Evaristo having a chat with Deborah Levy. But yeah, it was really exciting to be a part of that and to see Kairos announced as the winner, which I was sort of expecting, and I think a lot of people were expecting, though I don't think the authors and translators were expecting it, because their speeches were very stumbling and a bit awkward, and I really felt for them as they were giving their speeches, and just thinking like, oh you poor writers, and are now on this giant stage having to make this speech. But Kairos, yeah, I think was a good and sort of sensible winner, although there were other books on the shortlist that I really appreciated as well. And also, I went to see a new stage adaptation of Maggie Nelson's book Bluets at the Royal Court Theatre here in London. And so I made a whole video talking about this book before, and this upcoming production. And it was so interesting, because this isn't an obvious book to put onto the stage and to make into that format. And they basically took parts of Maggie Nelson's narrative and divided them between 3 performers who were speaking these different sections of the narrative, while also performing these small actions to kind of express what was in the text. But there were also cameras on the stage focused on these different performers, which were being projected up onto screens on the stage. And so there was this mixture of seeing the performers actually speaking and performing these actions, but then also the video really focusing intensely. So in some sections, the performers would lay their head on a pillow, and you would see them looking at their phone, and while another performer was giving a narrative, but then you'd also see that on the screen. So it looked like you were really up close and personal, getting this author's point of view in a very intense and close way. It took me a little while to adjust to this kind of creative stage type. I mean, I know this has been used in theater a lot recently, but yeah, it took a little while to adjust to it. But once I got into it, I thought it was really powerful and effective and very moving, and brought out so many of the themes of the book in a really interesting way. So yeah, that was a really unique and great experience. So now on to a lot of the books that I read over the past month, and I'll start with a positive one of an Irish novel, The Alternatives, which follows 4 sisters who were basically orphaned early on in their lives when they lost their parents to an accident. And they grow up to be fairly distant from each other, and to have very different vocations in their lives. And each of them is approaching the issue of climate change from very different points of view. So one is more like politician and is sort of working behind the scenes with companies and corporations and the government to try to enact change. Another is a kind of philosophy professor and communicating and speaking with students. Another is a food influencer and is looking at like sustainable food sources. And another is a geologist who's also a teacher, but is really looking at the land. And she in particular has chosen to withdraw from her present circumstances to live in a very isolated way and just kind of goes missing. And so her other sisters go looking for her to make sure that she's okay. And so for the first half of the book, we're following their separate narratives and points of view, and which are all really interesting. And then they all come together for the second half of the book, and we see their interactions with each other and how they play off from each other and their ideas. They have very different personalities and ways of approaching the world. And I found this really fascinating. I mean, each sister is like so successful kind of in her own way. Just kind of feels like maybe slightly unrealistic, but also maybe they're just like a very ambitious and talented family, and so they've all been able to go on and succeed in this way. But yeah, I found it really playful and enjoyable, how following their interactions with each other and the drama of their story alongside these larger issues that the novel is talking about in a really interesting way. So yeah, I thought this was a really strong novel. Now, one of my favorite books that I read last year was a new translation of Alba de Cespedes' novel, what was it called? Forbidden Notebook, yeah. Like, just when I'm talking about books, sometimes like author names and titles just like fly out of my head and I have to remind myself of them. But yeah, I thought Forbidden Notebook was such an incredible novel. I mean, it was first published like over 50 years ago in Italy, and this author is long deceased, but there's been a resurgence in her work, and she's been seen as a kind of big influence on Elena Ferrante, who's attributed, that she's been so influenced by this really interesting author. And so this was published this year, this much longer novel of hers called Her Side of the Story, which was first published in Italy in the late 40s and published in an English translation a number of decades ago. But there's this new English translation, which is much longer and more directly representative of the Italian text than the English version, which was previously published and which was more truncated and edited down. And it's really interesting because after having read this book in its entirety, I kind of agree that it could have used a lot of editing, because there are lots of brilliant passages in this and sections of this and ideas and themes that are brought to the forefront of giving a really strong perspective on women and female communities in Italy leading up to World War II and following the communities of women. And in the first section, it's really exploring that when the narrator is a child and her mother is really struggling. Her husband and the narrator's father is a really awful man. He just makes horrible comments to them, is really verbally abusive and dismissive towards her mother in particular. And her mother has so much creativity and is wanting to express herself and also falls for another man. And we follow the narrator as she really urges her mother to leave her father and leave their household and to try to find some happiness, but it doesn't work out that way. And so we follow her subsequently through the years, through her teenage years and into her early adulthood, as she herself falls in love with a man and gets married, but things don't go to plan. And yeah, the first section I thought was so strong in how it evokes this whole community of women, and there's some really powerful and beautiful passages, and there some really interesting sections subsequently. She goes to live with her father's family for a period of time, and there's a very strong matriarchal figure there who's a really intriguing character, but one that the narrator kind of rebels against, and then going into the war, and which really strikes Rome when she goes back to live in Rome, and so we follow her through this period of war and becoming involved in the rebellion of against fascism, and that all was so promising. But as the narrative goes on, it becomes increasingly circular and frustrating. She just gets locked in this sense and of this love for her husband, which she can't let go of, even though her husband is quite distant from her. He's really more involved in this rebellion and against fascism and this war effort, and that's what he really cares about. And yes, he's quite like dismissive of his wife and neglectful of her, but she just seems to want his attention all the time. And I feel like there were so many passages where she's just pining for his love and attention, and it got to be both repetitive and feel a bit pathetic of kind of like can't you just realize that this relationship isn't working out, and there were a number of alternatives open to her, but she was so steadfast in her trying to make this marriage work when it was really failing. So it was really faithful to her point of view in that way. And I know this happens with some people, but yeah, it just that got really frustrating. And also when depicting the war, it felt like you got a few small details about what was happening, and really the massive difficulty that so many communities were facing, but you didn't get a really like full picture of what was occurring, and even her own involvement in the efforts of fighting against fascism. It was more just to try to get attention from her husband, and so yeah, I found that really frustrating to follow, although yeah, I understand that it was just really faithfully representing her point of view, and people go through this, but I found that like challenging to read and slightly frustrating. And so I had so many expectations for this book, but ultimately found it a bit disappointing, although there were some absolutely wonderful passages in it. So again, I would kind of agree that it should be edited down, and because yeah, it would be a much more strong book in that way. It'd be really interesting to read the original English translation to see what was cut out. But yeah, I think a good 100 pages could be cut from this book, which is really saying something of a novel. And then we had the announcement of this year's Pulitzer Prize for Fiction of Jayne and Phillips' novel Night Watch, which I was so excited going into reading, even though I'd seen some critical opinions of it, and even though I think we can be really affected by these opinions, but when it comes down to the actual reading experience, the one-on-one experience of intense involvement of just you as the reader there on the page, I feel like all these other opinions, whether like positive or negative, like hype surrounding a book, it just kind of disappears. And so quite often I've found my opinions running contrary to popular opinion, and then other times I completely agree with it. So yeah, I don't think that's affected my reading experience so much, or the knowledge that it had just won this very prestigious prize, but I just found this such a disappointment, and of following a story of the Civil War, of both like towards the end of the Civil War and then a decade afterwards, and the narrative switches back and forth between those periods, but primarily follows that later period of time as a mother and daughter have entered into a mental asylum, because at the beginning the mother is almost comatose, and after having sustained years of abuse from a tyrannical man who has taken up residence in their home and really controlled her and her daughter and the subsequent children that they have together in this horrible abusive relationship. And I felt like that had so much potential, but it just, for so much of the narrative, it just sort of felt like we were following her progress of recovery, but not in a way that made me really like understand or appreciate her situation anymore. And so I found that really frustrating. And also to have this example of a very benevolent institution, which was based on a real asylum, which was very caring towards its patients and very progressive in handling these cases of mental health issues, but that didn't really feel representative of the time. And of course, it's wonderful reading stories of hope like this, and stories of great like humanity from the past in a time when so many people were damaged by the war effort, and there were lots of casualties, and people that even weren't directly involved in it that were massively affected by it. But I feel like there's a way of showing that in a novel and a narrative to give an understanding of that, yes, there may be people that were good and working for humanitarian causes, but there were also, yeah, a lot of tragedy around. And so, like, as a counterexample, I like to think of Thomas Keneally's novel Schindler's Ark. And, here's an example of someone who did stand up for what was right and made an effort to maintain a sense of humanity amidst a situation in which so many people were being dehumanized and killed. But the novel also, like his novel also showed the real like devastation and tragedy all around him. Whereas this, I mean, we get an example early on of when the mother is initially attacked and really brutally raped, and that is represented in really extended scene and really gruesome detail. But I didn't get a sense of like really her life going forward until she's taken to this institution at the very beginning, and so yeah, just the way that it traced the progress of that, I felt like it didn't give me a better sense or understanding of this historical period of time, which is what I feel like the author was trying to do. But yeah, I didn't get that. And I just found that the way that the plot moved forward was so cliched and clunky and really soap opera-ish that it felt really unbelievable and disappointing that there were so many coincidences. There were so many people that had double names, which were then like gradually revealed, and that it ended in this big climactic sequence, which felt to me like really forced. And so yeah, such a disappointing book. But I would like to go back and read her earlier novels, which I've read are kind of stronger books. And Kairos, with the winner of this year's International Booker Prize, I do think this is a really creative and strong novel, a really heavy intellectual novel. Like it's so clever in how it's structured, and the many references it describes, and the themes that it raises of a love affair between a very mismatched couple who are very different ages from each other in East Berlin in the late 80s, and following them over a period of years, and you witness the gradual devolution of that relationship, which becomes very abusive and toxic and horrible, and but as a way of both showing human relationships, but also I'm saying something much larger about the country and the way that people's ideals are can cling to their ideals over a period of time, even though it's clear that it isn't working out for them, and they really ought to find a different system of belief, both in their love affair and their sense of nationality, as East Germany is changing and has been reabsorbed back into West Germany and a more democratic system, a capitalist democratic system, which it's quite gives a critique of, as well as kind of critiquing the old system of communist system in East Berlin. And so, yeah, really interesting on a number of levels, but the experience of reading it becomes so claustrophobic and difficult towards the end that it's not a book that I would just immediately recommend to everyone, because the actual reading experience, I found not very pleasurable, especially in the second half of the book. But at the same time, I understood why the author did that, and it does create this impactful message. So yeah, it's a tricky book in that way, but a really strong one. So I also read The Details by Aya Genberg, a Swedish novel, which I had a lot of hopes for, especially because we sadly lost Paul Auster in the past month, and his novel is central to this story, or at least at the very beginning, of where the narrator finds a copy of Paul Auster's New York trilogy, which a former lover had given to her, and written an inscription inside. And so this takes her back to the past, and she starts thinking about all these memories and details about the past, looking at examples of people that have been very close to her in the past, and that were very important relationships to her, and as a kind of examination of these individuals, but also in telling them she's really saying more about herself than about these people in some instances. And so it's this whole look at our personalities and our relations with others, and how that is made up over time. And it is interesting in that way, although I found certain of the sections more compelling than others. I was a bit put off when there was one section about a one-time close friend of hers, who's a very erratic individual and who kind of runs off to Ireland to have a relationship, and she's kind of almost like commissioned by this friend's father to go find her in Ireland and track down his daughter. And she goes to do that, and she meets in a pub the Irishman that her friend went to run away with, and but her friend has since moved on, and then she has this long extended conversation with her friend's former Irish lover and his Irish friends in this pub, talking a lot about relationships and emotions in a way which felt like, would this really happen in an Irish pub with a group of Irish lads? Like I mean, maybe it would. Maybe I'm not giving enough credit to it, but it just felt kind of like forced and unrealistic to me. I mean, maybe that did happen, but then there were later sections that I did find much more effective, like a man named Alejandro that she has an affair with, and following that relationship, and a relationship with her mother, and which was very complex, and looking at that I found really moving. But on the whole, yeah, just like this book didn't really like stick with me, like all the details of it didn't really stick with me, and didn't have much of an effect on me. Like I understood that she was talking about these larger issues to do with personality and relationships, but yeah, it's just hasn't really stuck with me. But a book that did make a big impact was Not a River by Selva Almada, an Argentinian novel, which I wasn't really expecting all that much from, even though it was quite a short book, but I thought like, oh, okay, I'll read it. But then I got really into it and was just absolutely hooked by this story and the strange atmosphere that it creates of three men that go on a fishing trip and looking at their complicated pasts, and there's so much tension in this, which like gradually builds over the course of the story, and then suddenly become very panicked and worried about these men for a number of reasons as it builds up to this dance party occurring at this local community on this island. And yeah, wow. It really gripped me, and I found it really eerie and spooky, but also very thoughtful and considered, looking at families and communities and people that enter into communities from the outside and how this can be very intrusive and yeah, and there was so much imagery in this that was really tantalizing, and that's really stuck in my mind, but also scenes where she brings in a lot of like humor and warmth and humanity to them, as well as creating this very eerie atmosphere. It's just so effective, and I'm really looking forward to reading more by this author. Another novel that was very creative and really ambitious in what it was doing is the debut novel, The Ministry of Time, which I went in and started reading and wasn't really sure of at first, but then I got really into it. I settled into, I think, the tone of the novel, which balances the comic and this kind of more serious critique and look at history and society and issues to do with like immigration and genocide and much like bigger issues, and it like balances these things really well while telling this like romantic tale of a woman in the near future who's in the unnamed narrator of the story, and her relationship with a man from the 1800s who went on an Arctic exploration and then disappeared, and how he's brought into this present time, and she's his minder at first, and then they form a romantic relationship with each other, and so yeah, such a creative approach to storytelling and looking at time travel and yeah, all of these much larger issues, and so it becomes a very involving and thrilling tale, but also a meaningful one. It's really intelligent how she handles all of the subject matter too, and there were a number of lines and scenes that were really effective and that have really stuck with me, and that inspired me to go out into the city of London to see a memorial to this Arctic exploration. So I really enjoyed this book, and again, it has beautiful end papers looking on the inside of the ship of this exploration, and but also how it moves back to the narrative of this previous time in history and following this Arctic exploration. And there's a tension and a thrilling plot to this historical narrative, as well as this near future narrative of looking at this issue to do with time travel and a larger government conspiracy plot. That's really intriguing. And I instantly went out and got and read Long Island, because I was so eager to return to the story of Eilish and following her 20 years later, following on from the novel Brooklyn, where we see her as she has moved to America and then has this massive dilemma between Ireland and America, and between one relationship and another. And then we follow her in a time when she has settled down, but then that is completely disrupted as it's revealed that her husband has impregnated another woman, another man's wife, and that she is going to be burdened with this child, which is going to be left on their doorstep. And so it's, what does she do going forward? And so she goes back to Ireland for her mother's 80th birthday, but to also try to figure things out and what she wants to do. But there, the narrative switches to two people that she knew in Ireland, of a close friend of hers that she had growing up, and a man that she had a romantic relationship with, and it alternates between their perspectives over the course of the novel, and it becomes equally thrilling. There's a kind of dilemma which is similar to the first book, but different and in a new context, where the characters have, it's much later in their lives. They've moved forward, and the circumstances and of the country, nation, and world have changed as well, very much. And so we've gone into the 1970s and following them going forward, and it is so compelling. I keep using that word compelling when talking about this book, but it just it really gripped me, and I was really emotionally invested throughout the entire book, and I thought it was really creative how he handled all of their stories and balanced them, and gave some answers, as well as creating some ambiguity and questions that are left as well. So I hope he continues writing this story and following these characters in subsequent novels as well, because I really want to see what happens to them going forward. It feels like he's creating this like almost like Balzacian ambition to represent whole specific individuals and families and communities over a period of time, but from many different points of view and at different points in history. And I think it's so wonderful how this great author is doing that. I also really enjoyed reading Crooked Plow. I thought this was a really powerful Brazilian novel depicting a agricultural community of a number of individuals and a family that they're the descendants of slaves, but in a way they are still subject to working this land and handing over profits to plantation owners, and so are really subject to the economics of the time. There is so much childhood death due to starvation when the crops go badly, and we follow a pair of sisters over a period of time who at the beginning they're very, very close to each other but gradually diverge over time, and it's really interesting following their different stories and their different paths in lives. I thought both their characters were so strong and really developed and changed in very interesting ways, but also as a depiction of this society and the inequities in it, and the growing labor movements, but the trouble with that as well, the conflicts they come into, but also the inheritance of culture and religious practices, and it's also beautifully represented, and what a powerful novel, and I thought this was such a great read. And now I'm currently reading a book which is close to me, and I'm so compelled by because it's my favorite author of Joyce Carol Oates, and it's Oates' biographer, Greg Johnson, who I've known for quite a while as well, and is a good friend, and so he has been a friend of Oates for many decades, and he has edited a series of letters that she wrote to him over this period of time from the 1970s into the early 2000s, and it's so compelling. It feels like such an intimate journey following along with Oates' life and getting these little snippets of her experience at the time of things that she was writing, but also things that she was reading, of movies that she was going to see, of friends that she was meeting, and different difficulties and tragedies that she encounters, but also and meetings with some very famous figures of talking about working with Martin Scorsese, of trying to adapt a novel of hers for the screen, which sadly never made it to production, but also having lunch with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and the experience of that, and how Jackie Kennedy was an editor at a publisher, and how Oates was trying to talk with her about authors that she was working with, but then Jackie just wanted to talk about horses and kind of switch the subject matter, and so you get little like insights and details about that, but also a lot because Greg Johnson is a writer of fiction as well, and he's a really wonderful writer, and so they discuss the craft of writing a lot as well, and so Oates is commenting on how her writing is transforming over time, how she becomes very interested in short fiction, microfiction, as well as writing plays, and just how she gets so excited by the craft of writing, and it really portrays really meaningfully and beautifully how she has such an active and creative mind. It's so like relentlessly active, and so it's when reading this, it's not surprising in a way that she's produced so many books, and it's really touching towards the end of the section I'm reading at the moment in the early 1990s. She mentions, I was reading this here this morning, and she mentions that she was starting to work on a Oxford book of American short stories and editing and this anthology, and it's so it was so funny reading that letter and how she was starting to edit this anthology. But then right next to me, I'll show you here on the shelf right next to me, this is the book that resulted from that process of editing these short stories and creating this anthology, and is just like brought this book alive for me. And it's like, wow, that was the result of what she was writing about and talking about in the present time when she wrote this letter to Greg Johnson. And so yeah, that was a wonderful little thing to have happen while I was reading this book, and so it's just such a pleasure for me. I mean, I just love reading anything by Joyce Carol Oates. So yeah, it was great reading that, and I've had another number of comments recently of people asking me, oh, I want to start reading Joyce Carol Oates, and where should I start? And can't you make a video recommending books to start with by Joyce Carol Oates? And I've actually made multiple videos about this, so I'll link those below. But if you just type into YouTube of Joyce Carol Oates, what to read first, you'll find my videos. But yeah, maybe I should make another video about this, because clearly people want recommendations of this, because I understand that it's quite overwhelming looking at Oates' back catalog and the dozens and dozens and dozens of books that she's published over time. It can be a bit overwhelming and uncertain where to start. But yeah, I'll link that all below. But I'd love to hear if you have read any of these books and what you think about any of them. But if you have been reading anything else recently that you would really recommend to me, I would love to hear about that in the comments below, whether it's positive or negative. But yeah, I'd just love to hear about how you're doing as well. But yeah, hope you have been reading good things and continue to be reading good things. And I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.